Welcome back to the program. As promised, I'm joined now by Liberal Senator James Paterson, live from Melbourne. Thanks very much for your company.
Great to be with you, Peter. Thank you.
You're a libertarian of some note. Let me get your views on the census, if I can. There's calls for it to be delayed by Nick Xenophon. He's going to do a media conference later in the afternoon. You'd have to be concerned, wouldn't you, about some of the privacy-invading changes that have occurred this time versus the last time it was conducted 5 years ago?
Well, I think it would be completely impractical and ridiculous at this point in the census, when most of the forms have already been sent out, for it to be delayed or changed in any way. That would impose a huge cost to the government. And the census is actually one of the most important sources of information for government and policy making. It's one of the best in the world. We are renowned for the fact that our government has the best data on need and issues in our community because of the census. So it's an important tool. I would encourage Australians to complete it. Obviously, we can't compel you to put anything in there you don't want to, but I think I'd encourage you to complete it and complete it fully. But
they can actually fine people for misinformation or indeed fine people pretty heavily for not participating. Do you think it should be compulsory with such large fines of literally $180 a day up to $1,800 if you don't participate? There is no right of refusal.
I think, Peter, of all the deprivations of liberty in modern life, compelling people to complete a census is a pretty minor deprivation of liberty, and it's something that is pretty essential to the good functioning of government in Australia. So, let's worry about some bigger issues of freedom before we start getting, going to the trenches over the census, I think.
Oh, but it's easy to say that. But, we take for granted our political culture, which has such robust cultural democracy. But there are plenty of countries that we could rattle off, not through ancient history, but modern history, that seemed like they were viable, functioning democracies, which turned out to be quite authoritarian in nature. This kind of information on individuals and the way it's now being stored rather than the way it was previously stored via the census with the electronic capacity and all the rest of it, doesn't it raise some concerns? Because complacency is the biggest enemy of democracy and liberty.
Well, Australians voluntarily give much more information than they'll be giving in the census night to banks and telecommunications providers and a whole lot of other organisations.
James Paterson. It's voluntary. That's
and they do so willingly, and I think in a pretty relaxed way. Peter, this is. I mean, I understand that there is some concern about this, but honestly, on the list of priorities, this is nowhere near the top. They're much bigger fish to fry than this. I think the likelihood of this being misused in any way is extremely low, and the benefits from this information to government is actually very substantial.
Well, the other issue, when you call the census line, as I decided to do yesterday, they've got an automated message which says that this information will not be used in a way that infringes your privacy and will never be used in that way by the ABS. It's words to that effect. They can't make that promise, can they? Because obviously any legislation that gets done by legislators such as yourself, the ABS is forced and required as an arm of government to comply with.
Well, Peter, I think the ABS makes that promise in conjunction with the government. That is certainly our view too, that it should never be used for anything other than providing government good sources of data for policy making. That is its purpose, and it should never be used for anything other than that. It's a good, solid promise, and one I expect to be adhered to.
Oh, I'm disappointed as a libertarian that you're not more outraged by this. You don't have to pop a tinfoil hat on. You can still be outraged, but we'll move on. We'll move on. I agree with you about the impracticality of what Nick Xenophon is suggesting with delaying it. That is absurd, but I'm surprised it's got to where it has without more concerns about privacy issues. But we'll move on from that. Let me ask you about another issue. Your colleague, Ken Wyatt, over in Western Australia, has lampooned young Liberals over there for putting forward a motion to State Council, I think it is, that the government, the Liberal government, should oppose and campaign against Indigenous recognition in the Constitution. He's labelled them misogynist in relation to Aboriginals as opposed to where it's usually used in relation to women. Your reaction to that?
Oh, look, Ken is a colleague I respect greatly, and he feels very passionately about this issue, and he's entitled to prosecute the case for constitutional change as rigorously as he wants to. But if we're going to have a debate as fundamental about changing the Constitution, I think it has to be done in good faith and in a good tone. And I have to say I was a bit disappointed with the way that Ken was speaking about opponents in this case. They have as much right as he does to prosecute their case, particularly given the fact that these are West Australian Liberal Party members, people who worked very hard for his election and re-election and the re-election of the government and his colleagues. In the Liberal Party, Peter, there's a compact between the organisational wing and the parliamentary wing. We are not bound by the policy debates and decisions that the organisational wing makes, but in exchange for that, they are free to have those debates, and I think that's a very important thing, and I hope they'll be able to do so.
But he isn't just saying that he disagrees with them. He's basically labelling them a version of racists effectively, by saying that they don't want to treat Aboriginals equally. That's what his quotes in The Australian suggest. He's essentially calling the young Liberal wing who are pushing this motion in his home state racists. Do you think that there's racist elements there?
No, I don't. I think that is an unfair and untrue label. My own view on constitutional recognition, Peter, is that there's a very strong case for removing the sections of the Constitution which refer to race. They are anachronistic and outdated, and they should be removed. I'm yet to be convinced, though, Peter, that replacing those with a new set of words which refer to heritage or ethnicity or indigeneity would necessarily be a step forward. And I think we have to have a debate about that. We have to decide whether the Constitution is an appropriate place for this kind of recognition or symbolism. That's a healthy debate which will, I think, happen in the parliamentary Liberal Party as well it will in the organisational wing and in the community more widely. And I think it's very unfair for people to be labelled in that process. They should be able to engage in that freely without that kind of censure. Well,
if Ken Wyatt was here, though, judging by the way that he labelled those young Liberals in Western Australia, he would call you the same, an ethnicity-based misogynist. What would your response to that be?
Well, I would hope that he wouldn't. As I said, I have a great deal of respect for Ken. He's a valued
if he's consistent,
colleague.
He would.
And I understand his passion about this issue, but I think it's entirely legitimate to take the view, as I and I think many Australians do, that there is no place for race in our Constitution. There should be no negative references to race. There should be no positive references to race. It is a dry governing book. It is the rule book of Australia, and I think there are certainly a place for symbolism in public life, but I'm yet to be convinced the Constitution is the place for that.
Let me get your views on this whole... We haven't spoken since this is all brewed up, the whole saga involving Kevin Rudd and Cabinet's decision to scuttle his dreams and hopes and ambitions to head up the UN. We all know character assessments that have flowed pretty freely about Kevin Rudd from his own Labor colleagues. That said, though, the Prime Minister said he's not qualified, essentially. If a former Prime Minister, a former Foreign Minister and a man responsible for getting Australia onto the Non-Permanent Security Council for the first time in its history isn't qualified to head up the UN, who is?
Well, I think the Prime Minister said he wasn't suitable, and I agree. And I don't think we should treat Kevin Rudd as just any former Prime Minister or any former Foreign Minister. This is a man whose character flaws were so manifest that his own party decided to remove him as Prime Minister in incredibly acrimonious way.
Well, can I just ask you on that?
Just to
jump in, though, on that. Presumably, highlighting his own party's desire to remove him from office the way that they did in his first term renders him unsuited as a person for such a position. You'd say the same about Tony Abbott. No government appointments for him that would be supported by you, Peter, on the same grounds.
There's a really big difference in the way that the leadership transition occurred in the Labor Party and in the Liberal Party. I think I wasn't there at the time. I came in after it, as you know, but the Liberal Party changed leaders more in sorrow than in anger, and nobody went on the record with kind of outrageous character assessments of Tony Abbott. The Labor Party was very clear about Kevin Rudd. They basically said he was mentally unfit to be Prime Minister. That is nothing that anyone have ever said about Tony Abbott. And so I think they're two clearly different situations.
No, fair point. But nonetheless, that CV, though, it does speak of a CV of someone who's qualified to be Secretary-General of the UN. You'd at least agree with that.
Yes, Peter, but I don't know about you. If you've ever hired anyone, I don't hire people on the basis of their CV alone. There's a reason why you have an interview and you like to meet someone because, frankly, I think character matters, and I think Kevin Rudd's character is in question for this role.
Well, I don't think you're alone in that view. Senator James Paterson, we appreciate your company. Thanks for joining us on Newsday.
Thank you, Peter.